So maybe you saw all the RTX 3090 Ti reviews the other week and you thought, just how ridiculous is it a single graphics card can cost $2,000? Well, today we have the perfect antidote for you. We are checking out a full pre-built system with an Intel i5 and RX 6600 priced at £999. But has it been well built? That's what we're going to find out today. Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are checking out a new pre-built system from PCSpecialist called the Magnus Spark. This system will set you back £999 and it packs in Intel's i5-12400F, an AMD RX 6600, 16GB of DDR4 memory and a 1TB SSD. Considering how ridiculous PC prices have been for the last 2 years, it is great to see a sensible spec like this on offer at an attainable price point. Of course, dropping £1,000 on a gaming PC is still a very hefty investment, so you'll want to know that PCSpecialist has done a good job when putting the Magnus Spark together, and that's why we're here. So let's dive in and check out this system. We'll start then by taking a tour of the components and checking out the build itself, and I want to kick off with the case. The reason I'm starting with the case is because this isn't actually an off-the-shelf unit from the likes of Corsair or Fantex, rather it's a PCSpecialist own brand chassis. Dubbed the PCS 209 ARGB, this is a compact mid-tower and you can definitely tell it has been built to a price, with fairly thin and cheap feeling steel used throughout. I don't really think this is the end of the world though, as for most people they're either going to put it on the floor or on their desk and only touch it when they turn the system on. Still, it is definitely worth noting the case is one area where PCSpecialist has definitely saved on some cost. We do still get a tempered glass side panel though, but slightly more worrying for me is the fact that the front panel is completely solid, with just small perforated sections on the sides to allow airflow into the chassis. But of course we will check out thermal performance later in the review. I do have to give PCSpecialist immense credit though, as the overall build in this chassis is very well done, with superb cable management throughout. We can also see plenty of space towards the front of the case to allow for a bigger GPU if you want to upgrade down the line. Everything is very stealthy in appearance too, with absolutely no colour on show. That is until you power the system on, where we can see some RGB LEDs on the air cooler and the 120mm fan, as well as this LED strip on the front panel of the case. Getting into the components used then, we're going to start off with the motherboard, and here PCSpecialist has gone for the ASUS Prime B660 Plus D4, with the D4 denoting the fact that this motherboard uses DDR4 memory instead of DDR5. Now, while I wouldn't say this motherboard is going to blow you away with its VRM or its feature set, I do have to say it has proven absolutely rock solid for me during my last couple of weeks with this system. The only potential negative is the fact that it doesn't have built-in Wi-Fi, so for this PCSpecialist is actually using a PCI-E add-in card, and this has been placed in the second and only other X16 slot. For most people this is unlikely to be an issue, but say you are one of the few people who wants to use a second PCIe device like a capture card, then this could be a problem. Moving on though, we can also take a look at the memory, where we've got 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 clocked in at 3200 MHz or mega transfers, with 16, 18, 18, 36 timings. This is a very solid memory kit in my opinion. There's absolutely no need to waste budget on DDR5 memory at a system of this price point, and I also think 16GB is going to be absolutely fine for the everyday gamer or user. Next to the memory then we have the air cooler, which is another PCSpecialist branded component called the FrostFlow 100 RGB V3. This is a typical air tower in the style of something like the Hyper 212, with 4 heat pipes and a single 120mm fan, which should honestly be absolutely fine for the i5 12400F. On the topic of cooling as well, we can note a single 120mm intake fan at the front, with another 120mm exhaust in the back of the case. As for storage, this is provided by a 1TB PCS branded PCIe SSD, and a quick Google suggests that NetAC is the OEM for this model. It's only a PCIe Gen 3 SSD rated for 2200 megabytes per second reads and 1500 megabytes per second writes. Do note the placement of the SSD though in the bottom right of the motherboard, as this is something we're going to talk about in a lot more detail later on in this video. For the grunt of this system then, we already mentioned Intel's i5 12400F, a 6-core Alder Lake CPU, with all of its cores being of the performance variety, so there's actually no efficiency cores in this processor. It is still a very solid choice, however, and the Prime B60 Plus D4 had absolutely no issues maintaining its all-core turbo speed of 4 GHz. Just be aware, as it's not a K SKU, it's not overclockable. And then for the GPU, we have the AMD RX 6600, specifically the XFX Swift model, which uses a dual fan cooler with a metal backplate. Now, I did a full review of the RX 6600 back when it launched in October, and while it's fair to say it's not going to set the world alight, based on current prices, I do actually think this is the best value GPU on the market right now, so it's definitely a good inclusion for a system at this price point. Last but not least then, we have the power supply, which is a Corsair 550 watt TXM unit, which is semi-modular. It is 80 plus gold, however, which is very good to see. PC Specialist hasn't, kind of cut corners with a cheapo 80 plus bronze unit, so that is definitely reassuring. Once more, I do also want to give PC Specialist immense credit for the superb cable management round the back of the case. Maybe KitGuru's own modder and reviewer James Dawson could have done an equally stellar job, but I know for myself, I definitely couldn't. That's it for the build and all the different components then, so let's move on to performance. Here we're going to start with a look at some CPU and system benchmarks before focusing on the gaming side of things. We do have a few different comparison systems today, but the spec of each one is clearly labelled on the charts, so you know exactly what we are comparing to what. Starting with 3D Mark TimeSpy then, this is the CPU side of the benchmark, and we can see that the i5 12400F in the Magnus Spark scores almost 1,000 points higher than its direct predecessor, the i5 11400F, as used in the PC Specialist Fusion Spark. Understandably though, the i5 12400F is lagging behind the 12600K, as that CPU does offer an extra 4 efficient cores as well as higher clock speeds. A similar pattern can also be observed in Cinebench R23. The extra performance on offer from 6 Alder Lake cores versus 6 Rocket Lake cores is definitely noticeable, both in the single core and multi-core tests. As for the 3D Mark TimeSpy GPU score, this is also pretty much what we would expect. The RX 6600 is only fractionally faster than the RX 5600 XT in this benchmark, while it scores about 8% lower than an RTX 3060. Moving on though to memory speeds, these were tested with Ada64 Engineer, and for 16GB of DDR4 memory, honestly, performance is exactly where it should be, with read speeds just shy of 49,000 megabytes a second, and write speeds around 46,500 megabytes a second. Finally, I am also going to throw up PC Mark 10. We're not really going to include any direct comparisons here, but this is a good point of reference if you want to test your own PC and see how it compares against the Magnus Spark. Still on the topic of system performance, I can't go any further with this review without circling back to the SSD. I already mentioned its placement was potentially a little odd, and as it turns out, PC Specialist's decision to put this SSD in the M.2 slot they did does result in lost performance. Being completely honest with you, I was only really looking at this because I just thought it looked a bit odd how this SSD had kind of been shunted so far down the motherboard in the bottom right corner. Upon checking the B660 Plus D4's manual though, we can see that this slot is labelled M.2-3, which I've highlighted here with a pink rectangle. What's interesting though is that the manual goes on to specify that slot M.2-3 is a PCIe 4.0 by 2 slot, unlike the other two slots on the board that are both PCIe 4.0 by 4. Theoretically, a PCIe 4.0 by 2 interface still provides almost 4 GB per second of bandwidth, which far exceeds the speeds that this SSD is capable of. However, we have already mentioned that this is actually a PCIe Gen 3 SSD, so the decision to put this SSD in slot M.2-3 means it's only going to be receiving 2 PCIe Gen 3 lanes, halving bandwidth to just under 2 GB a second. To make my point then, I ran Crystal Diskmark 8.04, starting with the drive in its original M.2-3 slot. But then I also physically moved the SSD to slot M.2-2, which is directly adjacent to slot M.2-3, but it operates with 4 PCIe 4.0 lanes. As we can see then, SSD speeds across the board are hindered by the use of slot M.2-3. Sequential read speeds, for instance, improved by almost 800 megabytes a second, moving it to the next slot over, while sequential write speeds also improved by almost 400 megabytes a second. For me, how you look at this situation can go either one of two ways. On the one hand, the 1TB SSD isn't the fastest to begin with, and I'm honestly not even convinced anyone buying this system would even notice that its speeds are being limited. On the other hand though, I do think it's more about the principle. Just the fact that this SSD has been installed in the wrong M.2 slot, which prevents it from achieving the speeds it's capable of, is definitely a problem. It's clearly not the end of the world, but for me there is just no excuse when the M.2 slot, literally next to the one that was used, will offer faster all-round speeds. Moving on though, it's finally time to talk about gaming, where we tested 7 different titles, all benchmarked using the Ultra or equivalent presets. No doubt about it, the combination of the i5-12400F and RX 6600 is very solid overall. Certain games like Cyberpunk 2077, with the image quality maxed out, can prove a bit too much to hit 60 FPS at 1080p, but honestly everything else I tested blew through Ultra settings at 1080p, and that includes Dying Light 2 and Far Cry 6, which are still pretty heavy titles even by modern standards. 1440p gaming isn't off the table either, though you just may need to be a little bit more sensible with the image quality settings and potentially dial them back to the high preset. Still, Forza Horizon 5 played great at 1440p using the Ultra preset, and if you're only interested in esports titles like Rainbow Six Siege, you are going to get fantastic frame rates no matter what. As for thermal performance then, you may remember I had some concerns about the sealed off nature of this front panel, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. As it turns out, I needn't have worried, as the CPU ran no hotter than 58 degrees Celsius on the package when stressed with a 30-minute Cinebench R23 run, and it actually ran about 10 degrees cooler while gaming. The RX 6600 is also perfectly fine, with the GPU temperature peaking at 61 degrees, while the hotspot only hit 73 degrees, so there's absolutely nothing to worry about. I still wouldn't say that airflow is going to be ideal in this case, but considering the fact that PC Specialist is using 2 of the most power efficient PC components released over the last 9 months, they have been able to get away with it. There's also no problem for noise levels as well, as the fan speed from this system is very innocuous. It does emit a very quiet hum while idling, but it honestly doesn't get much louder under load. You could comfortably drown out the fan noise with a small pair of speakers, and you definitely wouldn't hear a thing if using a gaming headset. Lastly, power draw is also nice and low for the Magnus Spark, hitting just 210 watts while playing Cyberpunk at 1080p. This figure could rise slightly depending on how CPU heavy the games you play are, but Cyberpunk isn't light on the CPU and power draw is still very low. This also leaves plenty of headroom to swap out the GPU down the line, with the likes of an RX 6700 XT or RTX 3070 being potential drop-in upgrade candidates. All in all then, the PCSpecialist Magnus Spark is a very solid pre-built. For me, the best thing about this system is that it doesn't waste any budget on poor or unnecessary components. The core spec is just very sensible, with the i5-12400F and the RX 6600 being two of the best value components released over the last few months. Also, despite the fact that it has been built to the £999 price point, I'd also say that no major corners have been cut. Yes, the case is a little bit flimsy and cheap feeling, but it's nothing terrible and still gets the job done, while we also still have a 1TB SSD, 16GB of DDR4 memory, and the B660 Plus D4 motherboard also proved rock solid during my testing. Speaking of the SSD, however, this is my one real complaint about the Magnus Spark. As we showed earlier, it's simply been installed in the wrong M.2 slot, meaning it's only receiving 2 PCIe lanes instead of 4, which does result in reduced performance. Still, the PC is usable even when the SSD isn't running as fast as it should, but this is still an absolutely needless error when PCSpecialist just needed to install this SSD in the next slot over. That SSD issue and the fact that there's no spare X16 slot, which probably won't bother many people at all, are my only two real complaints with this system, and I do think they can both be overlooked, especially when we factor in the sheer value on offer from the Magnus Spark. To prove that, I spec'd out an equivalent system using PC Part Picker, with DIY pricing coming in at over £1,100. Granted, I wasn't able to get an exact match for all the different components, and of course the actual cost to PCSpecialist is going to be lower than that, but still, the sheer fact remains that it's cheaper for PCSpecialist to build this for you, ship it out to you, and cover it with a warranty than it would be to build it yourself, which for me is quite staggering. That's where I'm going to leave this review though, guys, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, leave me a comment down below. If you're in the market for a new pre-built system, is the Magnus Spark something you would consider? Let me know your thoughts. You can also subscribe and ding that notification bell if you haven't already, and why not come chat with us over on our Discord server, which is linked in the description. While you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous, you can even consider backing us on Patreon. That is it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.